Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Detox Summit. This is Deanna Minnick, and today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. David Perlmutter. Dr. Perlmutter is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of the book Grain Brain. I'm sure you've seen and even read this wonderful book detailing us about wheat, carbohydrates, and sugar, and how these compounds, how these foods really impact our brain. So Dr. Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist and fellow of the American College of Nutrition. He has been really very active in the media and really getting the word out about brain health and the foods that we're eating. So welcome to the Detox Summit, Dr. Perlmutter.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Great. Well, I have a number of questions for you, especially as it relates to the brain and talking about toxins and really wanting to go deep into those areas. But before we do that, I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about you on a more personal level. So your personal story, if there's anything in your life where you've had a real toxic exposure, we might want to know about that too.
That's a very interesting way to start an interview. And I'll say that, I've been involved in neurosciences since I was a young boy. I mean, I used to scrub in on brain surgery procedures with my father when I was probably 13 and 14. And so I really cut my teeth at an early age in the neurosciences. He used to quiz me at dinner about this or that strange syndrome. And so early on in life, I was kind of already exposed to brain science, and I kept with that throughout my college years. During my undergraduate time, I actually spent my summers at the University of Florida in the Department of Neurosurgery doing research on what was then called microsurgical anatomy. This was a time when neurosurgeons were just starting to implement the use of what's called the operating microscope, bringing a binocular microscope into the operating room and actually allowing them to have incredible vision to perform very delicate brain operations. The problem was at that time, there was no anatomical guidelines for them in terms of this microanatomy. So I entertained myself in the summers of college by dissecting human brains and mapping out under the microscope the anatomy that a surgeon might encounter when he or she was taking an aneurysm apart or dissecting out some small lesion near some delicate nerves, and ended up during my senior year in college publishing in the Journal of Neurosurgery an article entitled Microsurgical Anatomy of the Anterior Cerebral Anterior Communicating Complex, which again was sort of paving the way for this whole notion of microsurgical anatomy. So thereafter, of course, went to medical school and studied neurosurgery and neurology, and came out of medical school and residency and went into private practice, again, very much involved in the neurosciences, but I kind of got, terrible to say, but I kind of got sidetracked for a decade, practicing very mainstream orthodox neurology, and really found myself to be very frustrated by that, in that really all we were doing was prescribing medications to treat symptoms, and we were ignoring what was causing these diseases. What was the underlying factors that, in fact, we've now learned are controllable, that actually led to the things we were trying to treat only by symptom management. I began exploring the role, for example, of nutrition in brain health. Who knew? And recognized that there are powerful roles to play with the foods that we eat in terms of determining the destiny of our brain, the destiny of our cognitive function, the destiny of our ability to control our movements, for example. And this was a very, very exciting time for me, recognizing that, in fact, there was already literature out there that supported this notion. And I began at that time to tie into various leaders in the field who were involved in integrative medicine, nutritional medicine, and within a short time realized that in these groups, there was nobody really taking a leading role in terms of how nutrition and integrative medicine related to the field of neurology. So I found myself kind of in the catbird seat where this was a wide open field, and I felt welcomed to kind of take the lead in developing a body of understanding, a body of knowledge, exploring and revealing the powerful role, for example, of nutrition and other lifestyle influences in determining brain health, brain function, and the ability of the brain to resist disease, resist degeneration. And that kind of has culminated to where I am today, teaching a lot, lecturing a lot to doctors, not just in integrative medicine, but even mainstream medicine now, who are beginning to recognize that this is a very important area for us to explore, that to live our lives with the notion that we can do whatever we want, and then when we suddenly find ourselves impaired in one way or another, that there's a magic pill to help us. That's not reality. It's not good medicine. And I'm so grateful that the world has opened up for me to allow me to kind of champion the other side of that story.
Hmm. What a beautiful journey. What a great path. And, starting out as a precocious young one, really being involved with the brain. And it sounds like so much of your path has really focused in on the brain, and you've become an expert. You've really become that pioneer for so many people to get the right information about nutrition and lifestyle. So I can really appreciate this unfolding path.
Well, Deanna, the word doctor does not mean healer. It means actually teacher.
Hmm.
And as you know, you've attended many of my lectures. I'm just thrilled that people are interested in what I'm doing right now. That you would have me today up here on this broadcast because you're interested in what I've uncovered, what I think is important is a huge honor. It's very, very validating for me.
Hmm. Well, we're so glad that you're here because we really do need an expert to talk about toxins in the brain as part of this detox summit. Because, as you probably know, not many physicians have been trained in nutritional medicine. And so there's also this idea that a nutritional detoxification is completely woo woo. It's a myth. There's no real credence to it. So I'm just wondering, in all of your, the preponderance of experience that you have, how much have you seen a role of toxins of various forms be involved in people's brain health and neurological function?
Well, let me take a step back then and kind of define what is a toxin. So, a toxin is a component of exposure that leads to maladaptive, detrimental function. Now, that can come in the form of well recognized toxins like phthalates and heavy metals, etc. But I think the biggest concern in the realm of toxins that we are exposed to these days are sugar and carbohydrates. These are the most ubiquitous toxins around. They are associated quite clearly in the medical literature with profound issues as they relate to brain dysfunction. And while it's certainly important to consider food allergies, their toxic role, and metals and other chemicals that I've mentioned, organic, volatile organics, etc., I think the biggest issue that is most controllable and therefore really should be on the front page in terms of what we recognize as being specifically and directly toxic to the brain are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates in the diet translate to higher levels of blood sugar. I mean, that's not a revelation. That's, basically scientific fact. And when we see articles, for example, like appeared in the August 8th, 2013 issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, that perfectly correlates even mild elevations of blood sugar to risk for developing dementia, we have to take notice, recognizing that dietary carbohydrates and sugars are leading to dementia because they are specifically and directly toxic to the brain. They inhibit mitochondrial function. They compromise both energy production at the mitochondrial level and at the same time, through some mechanisms that we will probably explore, they at the same time upregulate the production of the chemical mediators of inflammation and also enhance the production of damaging free radicals. So carbohydrates in and of themselves are perhaps, in my opinion, the biggest toxin and unrecognized toxin of all, leading to free radical mediated stress and leading to inflammation.
Mm. Now, when you say carbohydrate, that encompasses a wide variety of different compounds. We're thinking simple sugars. Then there are starches. There are fibers and soluble fibers. So, can you tell the listeners a little bit more about what you mean when you say carbohydrates? Are we saying all carbohydrates or specific ones?
Short answer is all. And, while there are good things in foods that contain carbohydrates, like vitamin C, other nutrients, and as you mentioned, fiber, very important, I think at the end of the day, we have to look at the carb content and make some serious decisions as to what that could potentially be doing, not just in terms of liver issues from fructose, but specifically in terms of insulin signaling from glucose, for example, in fruit. Now, that said, you mentioned starch. And what happens to these complex carbohydrates? What happens to starch once it's in our digestive tract? It is, of course, broken down into sugar molecules, which are then absorbed as sugar molecules. So I think it's really relevant to consider total consumption on a daily basis of carbohydrates from all sources. To derogate simple carbohydrates and sugars while saying that, well, other more complex carbohydrates are certainly reasonable choices for the diet doesn't really sit well, at least with me, because again, these complex carbohydrates are broken down to sugar in the gut and absorbed as sugar. And that said, I mean, that's one of the big arguments in favor of having wonderful whole grain bread as opposed to having our highly refined white bread. Everybody says, oh, I don't eat anything white. I don't have white bread. And, the reality is the whole grain goodness that we're told to favor still is a powerful source in the human diet for carbohydrates rather. I mean, the glycemic index of whole grain bread is at 71, according to Harvard School of Public Health. So that's not very different from the glycemic index of white, highly processed bread that we're told to avoid. And it has a higher glycemic index than a teaspoon of pure sugar. So that said, again, these sources of carbs that we're told to not add in, not worry about, I think this is sending the wrong message to individuals. What should we have at breakfast? Well, start your day with a couple of 12-ounce glasses of fresh squeezed orange juice. That sounds like a reasonable choice because why? It might have some pulp in it. And of course, it's a wonderful source of vitamin C. Where do we sign up for that? Where do we sign up for the recognition that two 12-ounce glasses of orange juice provides 18 full teaspoons of sugar, 72 grams of carbohydrate? It's about the same as drinking a couple of cans of soda at breakfast. And that's, again, before the breakfast cereal and the pancakes and the syrup have arrived. You've already had 72 grams of carbs, and these are not complex carbs, not that it matters. These are simple carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all very good points, of course. Now, something that I learned in basic physiology class many years ago was that the brain prefers glucose. The brain prefers sugar in order to work well. In fact, I think I remember something like 18 to 30% of the glucose that we take in or the sugar that we take in is used by the brain. So, how do we give the brain the energy it needs if we're not feeding ourselves carbohydrate?
Quite simply because the brain does not prefer anything. It will burn glucose when it's available, but the brain can function far more efficiently by burning fat. Ketone bodies are a super fuel for the brain to the extent that there is now a medical food supported by the FDA that you can buy with a prescription, for example, to treat an Alzheimer's patient. Giving the brain fat to burn is a far more efficient fuel, creates far more ATP, and does so with less production of damaging free radicals. It upregulates or turns on what is called mitochondrial biogenesis, the growth of new mitochondria. It stimulates the growth of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, to strengthen neurons and actually leads to the epigenetic control of the growth of new brain cells, a process called neurogenesis. BDNF, brought on by fueling the brain with fat, actually increases what's called neuroplasticity, or the ability of brain cells to connect to each other, which is fundamental for the process of learning. It also enhances the repair of neurons when they're damaged. So the notion that we need to be eating carbohydrates to power the brain is kind of, with all due respect, a bit old school. The brain does burn 25% of our resting calories, but the brain powered by fat is a real force to be reckoned with. I mean, you have to understand that, the notion of carbohydrates in the diet, to the extent that they are today, is brand new. We've never, in our history on this planet, for 99.9% of our time here, had access to carbohydrates to the extent that we have today. And basically, we had to burn fat for our brains, and that adaptation has really allowed us to survive. Truthfully, we have what are called essential fats. There's an essential requirement of fat in the diet, as there is with protein. You know, of course, about what are called essential amino acids. But there is absolutely no requirement for carbohydrate in the human diet at all. Not 1 calorie of carbohydrates is required for human physiology.
Mm, thank you for that. A really nice overview. So, when you say that the brain prefers or can break down fat, that would be an acceptable substrate for fuel for the brain, I'm just wondering, a lot of our listeners have already heard from a number of people interviewed by way of the Detox Summit that toxins like fat. They like to sink into fat. They're lipophilic or fat loving. So if we start to eat more fats in the diet, are we going to see a greater toxin load coming into our brain?
It's a very good question. And I think that should transition us to the notion that let's look for optimal choices. And optimal choices, of course, in fats will be organic extra virgin olive oil, organic raised grass-fed beef, pasture-raised eggs, organic raised butter, and that will help to reduce the availability in your physiology for the fat-soluble toxins. It's a very good question, but I think it makes for a very nice transition, since we are talking about epigenetics in terms of growing new brain cells by having a higher fat diet. Let's talk about how we control genetic expression to enhance our ability to rid ourselves of the very toxins that you describe. So that said, we do know that one genetic pathway called the NRF2 pathway is intimately involved in the role of enhancing our ability to detoxify, so that activation of this pathway helps the body create things like glutathione S-transferase, superoxide dismutase, glutathione, etc., all important for reducing free radical activity and enhancing our ability to phase 2 detoxify and excrete the very toxins that we have consumed. So what can we do? We can obviously go through various detoxification programs and take various supplements. That's true. But even more importantly, how can we, right off the bat, accentuate the very detoxification programs that are written into our own DNA? And they exist. And that's what is one of the major roles of NRF2 activation, and that is to enhance our ability to detoxify. So the question then is, what can we do to turn on the NRF2 pathway? Number one, we can reduce our calorie consumption, especially carbohydrates. Number two, aerobic exercise is a powerful upregulator of that pathway. Now, from a nutrition perspective, we know that this is a pathway that is wonderfully targeted by cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower. It's also targeted by drinking coffee, by consuming turmeric, green tea, DHA, the omega-3. These things all upregulate this endogenous control system that we have that can turn on our body's ability to rid ourselves of things that we're exposed to that are dangerous, including helping even chelate out various metals to which we are exposed. So I think it's a good point to go back to the idea of eating high fat. And I would say that if you are on a high fat diet from grain-fed, GMO-fed animals being given hormones and antibiotics and drinking milk from these animals, eating their meat, eating their eggs, that puts you at great risk because indeed the fat content of those products will be contaminated by the various toxins that have been administered to those animals. There's no alchemy. You can't put garbage in and expect to get gold out. When you pass dangerous contaminated feeds to these animals and think somehow you're going to create a food that is safe. So I think as I talk about a high-fat diet, it's fundamentally important to clarify that this means a diet high in specifically good fats that are organically raised, that have not been hydrogenated and modified and put in their transconfiguration so that they have a long shelf life. These are fats that are as natural as we can get them. The other types of fats that are ultimately end up in the epidemiologic reports as being bad for you are in fact bad for you. Reports that eating a lot of meat is bad for your risk for cancer and diabetes and heart disease and who knows what else, I think they're very accurate because those studies lump together all meat that is eaten, most of which is contaminated and dangerous food.
You talking about meat and animal fat makes me think of some of the more recent studies on what we would call, now this is a fancy term, metabolic endotoxemia. So when we have a higher amount of fat in our diet, that this could lead in one meal to issues like leaky gut. And we've been hearing about that from some of the Detox Summit presenters. So are there certain fats that don't in one sitting where we don't get this effect of leaky gut? Or is that something we have to think about if we are moving towards more of a higher fat diet? Do we have to be concerned with our gut health? Because isn't the gut the second brain?
Oddly enough, the gut may very well be the first brain for that matter.
There you go.
Uh, and along those lines, let me just announce that in the fall, we will see the release of a new journal called Brain and Gut that really is going to be focused on exactly what you've talked about. The role of nutrition in gut health, the role of nutrition in controlling the microbiota, and how that might influence overall inflammation, metabolism throughout the body, and more specifically, what is the role of diet in terms of these issues in the gut as they relate to the brain. Now, there's no question that changes in the gut microbiota do have a role to play in this idea of metabolic endotoxemia and inducing inflammation. And I think that the studies, for the most part, are rodent studies. And the extrapolation, I think, takes a little bit of liberty. But I think it's important to, again, recognize that to say a high-fat versus a low-fat diet is like saying we're going to do a study on alcohol consumption and make no differentiation between a Merlot and Jack Daniels, for example, in looking at alcohol in general, just as these studies have done in looking at fat in general. So the type of fat is fundamentally important. There are fats that are good for the gut, that enhance the growth of appropriate microbiota. And certainly there are fats that do just the opposite. But, the idea that fat is something detrimental to human nutrition even on this basis, I think stretches the imagination when you recognize that for the past 2 million years, our diet has been deriving most of its calories from fat, and suddenly it's going to change the microbiome. I would submit that if the microbiome is protected by adequate amounts of appropriate fiber, for example, vegetable fiber, and we're not pounding the microbiome with steroids and antibiotics and chlorinated water, for example, then I think we're going to see a microbiome that gets back to wonderful epigenetic expression, that manifests the right gut milieu that has coded and allowed us to experience health that has gotten us to this point in our existence.
Well, I really like what you said about, again, tying in the gut with the brain and what you just left us with, which is making sure that we have that full complement of vegetables together with the fat to protect the microbiota. So I think that that's a real important takeaway for everyone. And we're hearing that from other speakers as well. So,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
that to castigate fat in the diet based upon the animal studies that are published by diabetes, for example, that based upon the term fat in general, most of these studies are done with the mice that have had their guts completely sterilized. Then they reintroduce diets and see what happens to the microbiome. And I think, again, extrapolating that interesting experimental protocol to what humans should be eating is a little bit of a stretch.
Hmm. So, you as a neurologist, being that your life has been very brain centric, even as a young child, and then publishing your first paper in college on the brain, if you're stating that the gut may very well be the first brain, how often are you working with patients on their gut health in order to address the brain and behavior, mood, and cognition?
Deanna, that's what I do all day long. So who knew? I am basically, in a 90-minute evaluation with the patient, maybe there's 15 or 20 minutes to tweak the medications, which isn't the most challenging part of the evaluation. Most of it is what are you eating? What are the supplements that you're taking? We're going to test you in various ways to determine your hemoglobin A1C, vitamin D level, homocysteine level, gluten sensitivity, and those parameters, and really look at what that individual likely has already done to his or her microbiome. How can we repair that? And then recognize that there is a fundamental role to play in terms of gut health and brain health. So again, it's basically what I do all day long. And I think it's a very, very important part of neurology that is really pretty much sitting by the wayside, that no one's paying attention to. And it can be so rewarding, so successful in turning issues around with people when you finally pay attention to that. I mean, whether it's a child with ADHD or a patient with dementia, there's a huge net to throw in terms of gaining information and making changes that can have a profound effect on that person's destiny. Here in America, we have 6.5 million children who have been labeled with ADHD as a diagnosis. Now, I'm not necessarily going to that place of faulting the diagnosis, but I'm simply saying if you look at the numbers, 2/3 of these kids are taking brain-altering stimulant medications with the approval, obviously, of their doctors writing the prescriptions, and parents going along with it as well. And I would submit that over 4 million American kids shouldn't be considered to be amphetamine deficient. That when we see children who are gluten sensitive, for example, and come off of gluten and suddenly gain back their focus and can sit in their chairs and pay attention, we have to take notice of that and we have to publicize that information. Now, critics would say, oh, in other words, you're saying that ADHD is caused by gluten sensitivity, and clearly I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that if 1%, and I know it's a lot more than that, but if 1% of the over 4 million American children goes off of gluten and doesn't have to be medicated, it's worth a try. What's wrong with going gluten-free for a month? There's no downside for the rest of your life to go gluten-free. There's no health risk. In fact, it has health benefits. But that said, I'm asking simply, why not give it a try if we can keep 1% of kids off of amphetamines?
Exactly. And every day we have to eat, right? We have to live, we have to eat. And so why wouldn't we be trying out certain ways to eat? I mean, it's not really incurring much in the way of cost. It's one of those low-hanging fruit opportunities. So I would agree with you. And you're bringing up another very hot topic, and that is this whole role of behavior as it relates to the brain. And eventually I'd like to talk with you about cognition too. But to first stay on the track of behavior, as you start to work with people on their food and their lifestyle, what do you notice? Can you give a case study or just an example as it relates to mood, behavior, changes in aggression or attention? Are there some really startling cases that you've had? And I know that there have been, so perhaps you can share with us just maybe one to really bring this home for the listener.
I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm overstating this, but this is really what we see just about every day. And it's hard to imagine that making dietary changes isn't hard to imagine for me, but maybe your listeners might think it is so. But virtually every day, we're seeing patients with any number of challenging issues, be it attention deficit disorder or depression or even cognitive issues, see dramatic reversals in their problems by simply adding more fat to their diets, restricting the carbohydrates fairly dramatically, getting some aerobic exercise, and most commonly going gluten-free. To that recipe, we often add vitamin D because we see so much deficiency of vitamin D, and it turns out to be playing a critically important role in brain health. We do find at times individuals who have heavy metal toxicity who respond beautifully to having heavy metals reduced to lower levels. But any case presentations, gee, I put them in Grain Brain. I think that might be one of the reasons it's had such a great run so far. There is a case in Grain Brain in the book of a child who came to see me when he was 5 years old, and he was actually brought to us by one of our CAT scan technicians, and he had been to a pediatrician who said that he had ADHD and needed to be on a stimulant medication because he did have anger outbursts when he was frustrated. He recommended putting a 5-year-old on a mind-altering medication, the long-term consequences of which we still don't know. And that said, so the child was brought to me, and I said, listen, let's just for the heck of it try not for the heck of it, but that's what I said to the parents, gluten-free diet, add in a little bit of DHA and actually a probiotic. This was a kid who had been on multiple courses of antibiotics for persistent ear infections, and in fact was on a 6-month course of antibiotics prophylactically, oddly enough, at age 5 years, to keep him from getting ear infections, and was also taking a powerful non-steroid anti-inflammatory medication because at age 5 years, his joints hurt. If this isn't a flagrant example of damage to the microbiome having inflammatory manifestations, I don't know what is. Well, 2 weeks later, the parents got an urgent phone call from the teacher thanking them for medicating their child. He never received any medications. When he was years later in the 5th grade, the parents sent me a note saying he's the tallest kid in their class. He's excelling in everything in math and English and never was medicated. Now, do we see that often? The answer is absolutely, we do. We see that a lot of times. Does every kid have a response like this? No. But again, I would submit that if even a certain percentage of children have a good response, not even a stellar response, but a good response to the extent that they don't have to take a medication, that's a good day's work. You know, Louis Pasteur said that chance favors the prepared mind. And my hope is that from this interview, that your listeners will at least take a step back and say, gee, there's no downside to what Dr. Perlmutter is talking about. Maybe we should consider giving that a try for our children or for our patients or for patients who may be suffering from depression or even early cognitive changes. Why not give it a try? What is there to lose? There's no downside. There's only upsides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. And how does somebody get started on this lifestyle approach? I mean, is it as easy as just stopping buying foods that contain gluten, or is it a little bit more sophisticated than that? You know, how would they embark upon this? Just some easy strategies to start reducing carbohydrate. And
well, you know, interesting. Last week in the New York Times business section was an incredible article talking about the $3 billion now that Americans are spending on gluten-free products. And the picture in the New York Times was of an obese woman buying with a child in the grocery cart, buying gluten-free ice cream cones. And, you know, so the message here is, yeah, gluten-free is important for many people, possibly for everyone, but beyond that, the gluten-free aisle is loaded with foods that are high in carbohydrates. So there's no magically wonderful approach to gluten-free if you're going to be eating gluten-free pastries, breads, pizza dough, etc., pasta. So the point is that whether it's gluten-free or not, if it's a high carbohydrate food, it has got to be literally off the table. And, you know, how to make this easy for people? probably there's no easy answer. It's dedication. It's recognizing that where we are in current science is really pointing a powerful finger at the role of carbohydrates in leading to things like diabetes, metabolic issues, and as such, cardiovascular disease and even dementia. I mean, the literature is vast and compelling and well respected. For example, one study appearing in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease was actually research that was put out by the Mayo Clinic, published in January of 2012, and they demonstrated that individuals favoring a high-fat diet had a 44% risk reduction for dementia, while those eating a higher carb diet had an 89% increased risk for developing dementia. So, that's well-respected information. Mayo Clinic, Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, and that stuff is coming out now. That type of literature is actually coming out in terms of cardiovascular disease as well. So one of the pushbacks has always been with respect to a higher fat diet that, these foods are going to narrow my coronary arteries. That's not reality. And, the studies that look at our coronary artery risk parameters like C-reactive protein, total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, fasting insulin, glucose, body mass index, weight loss, etc., go way back. They were published, for example, in the New England Journal of Medicine way back July 17th, 2008, demonstrating that when you compare a high-fat diet to a high-carb diet, that the high-fat diet wins out across the board in every one of those parameters that I mentioned. A similar study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association called the A to Z trial, published in 2007, came to the same conclusion. So the notion that a high-fat diet or even a diet that contains cholesterol is somehow bad for the heart is really not keeping up with current science.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. And we have Dr. Mark Houston, and Dr. Joel Kahn, who have definitely given their take on toxicity in the heart and how these nutrients play into that as well. So thank you for connecting the dots.
Sure, and I'll tell you, I've lectured with Mark Houston any number of times, and we just look at each other when we're sitting up on a panel, for example, and we look at each other because we're saying basically the exact same thing. And when you think of it, why would there be a heart smart diet and a brain smart diet? They should somehow be different. Why would there be one diet that's good for one part of the body but bad for another part of the body? No. The thing we've got to do is reduce carbohydrates back to a level that our bodies have been exposed to for 2 million years, because that is what sculpted our genome. That's the signal we sent to our physiology and our genome to allow us to have survived this long. Now, we all love sugar. We all love carbs. There's not a person on the planet who doesn't have a sweet tooth. People say, oh, I have a sweet tooth. I can't stop eating sugar. Well, some people have more willpower than others. But the sweet tooth that we have is an evolutionary issue that allowed us to survive, because sweet tells us that something is ripe. For example, fruit. Obviously, when fruit is ripe, it means that the starch has been changed into sugar. We like that. It's sweet. We ate it in the late summer and the early fall. We ate foods that had some glucose in them. That glucose in the late summer signaled our body to secrete insulin, and that insulin tells us that winter is coming. It tells us to make fat and store fat. So the sweet tooth that you have, that I have, is an evolutionary vestige that allowed our survival, so we gravitated towards sweet. We ate foods that stimulated insulin. It caused our bodies to make fat, and we made it through the winter. But now the winter never comes, and we have access to the sweet, ripened foods 365 days a year. And that is very simply the explanation as to the widespread obesity that we see now that we have unlimited access to carbohydrate.
Yeah, it's very true. And I'm just wondering, this whole thing about the sweet tooth is intriguing, right? Because it brings in the whole idea of food addiction and even these overwhelming food cravings that we have. And I'm just wondering your take on cravings. And you can make this very specific to sweet foods if you want. But, there seems to be a physiological reason for that, as you've described, perhaps programmed into our genes. And then do you think that there's a psychological aspect of craving sweet? What about the
Well, I'm not sure.
emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's totally fair to delineate those two. But let me, in answering the first part, I think you have but to look to the work of Dr. Robert Lustig, who's done a heroic job in recognizing and publicizing the role of sugar in terms of the brain's reward pathways. I mean, sugar makes people feel good. It leads to stimulation of brain centers and through the neurotransmitter dopamine that is a reward for us. For whatever reason, I have to have sugar. It's a reward. I feel better from a neurochemical perspective. Now, I don't know that you can tease that apart from, therefore, the psychiatric, psychological part of the story, because there's obviously this intimate relationship between neurotransmitters and mood, for example. But to widen the story a little bit, we do know, for example, that there are exogenous morphines, exorphins, that are found that are part of wheat and people say, I just have to have bread. I am addicted to it. And they are. They are not wonderfully, but they are significantly addicted to wheat because it's giving them a narcotic high that they have to have. That was wonderfully described by Dr. William Davis in his book, Wheat Belly. So, yes, indeed, people have difficulties in getting off of this stuff, but we are human. We do not have to be at the mercy of our more primitive brain centers. We can override those signals from our primitive brain centers through our prefrontal cortex and make better decisions that are rational and are based on information and experience, as opposed to just giving into our primitive reptilian brain, whose job it is to allow us to reproduce, to find food, etc. So it's a real question of stepping up to the plate, looking at the science, making a rational decision, and cutting back on carbohydrates as a result of that experience.
So, Dr. Perlmutter, you're presenting that as, we really need to be rational and logical and really muster up the willpower. What stands in people's way from really making that change and really moving out of these cravings? What do you see in your clinical practice that just makes the waters very murky and prevents them from really making that leap like you and others have into eating more healthy?
I think the biggest issue, in a word, would be advertising. So we are told to drink this and that, eat this and that, and basically that's what people give into. I mean, everything we're told to eat, that's is high carb. I don't need to mention names of these multinational corporations who control the provision of soda and cereals and bread and the wheat products, etc. This is hugely pervasive, and that's what you see on television and magazines. And beyond that, even here in America, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, whose mission statement defines making the ground fertile for farmers to raise crops and do well, they have somehow garnered the role of being in charge of telling us what to eat. The food pyramid comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture telling us what to eat, and yet it's their job helping farmers grow their stuff. Do you remember the food pyramid? What was the base of the pyramid? It was America's whole grain. That's what we were told to favor. Whole grain, high carbohydrate, devastating foods. At the very, very top of the food pyramid, if you remember the picture, was this lonely bottle of olive oil. And we were told that that's what we've desperately got to avoid. We've got to stop eating the dreaded fat. And that became governmental policy in 1992. A decade later, the rates of diabetes in America were up threefold, as well as other problems related to diabetes and related to metabolism. So again, there are a lot of market pressures that are at play here that are convincing people to go with drinking their soda and eating their whole grain, lifeless cereal in the morning, and drinking their orange juice and eating 6 to 8 servings of fruit each day. And again, this is wonderful for the farmers. It's great. But for your physiology, those are the worst choices you could make.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're coming up on the close of our interview. So you've said so many wonderful things, given so many pearls of wisdom and insight. I'm just wondering if you could summarize for the listener three takeaways that you really want people to remember from everything that you've said.
I think the most important issue is to recognize that indeed there are bad fats that people eat, and those are bad for your health. The modified hydrogenated damaged fats that are so prevalent in prepared foods are like coffin nails. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Fat has always been an integral part of human nutrition, and the idea of reducing fat today to the levels that we are told to do so by interest groups makes no sense, not just because I'm saying it today, but because that's what the science has been telling us for over a decade. That's mission number one. Number two is by all means, do everything you can to limit your carbohydrate consumption. It doesn't mean stop eating fruit completely. Nothing wrong with an apple a day, a handful of blueberries, wonderful. But eat mostly above ground, dark colored vegetables as organic as you can get, some below ground vegetables as organic as you can get. There is a place, for example, for sweet potatoes and beets and carrots. But as a rule, it's better to eat the whole vegetable as opposed to juicing, especially those juicers that tend to take out the pulp. The pulp looks like just stuff. It's actually dreadfully important for what we talked about at the beginning of the interview, and that is the microbiome. So these are the keys to health. And I think we've got to recognize that this gluten protein has worked its way into our physiology. It's foreign. We've never eaten gluten in our history. It's really relatively new since the advent of agriculture, just a blink of an eye ago, 10,000 years. So we've really got to follow the literature closely as it relates to gluten and its effects in human physiology. At the end of the day, I am certain that a constant theme with all of the presenters on this forum, on the summit, has to do with diets to reduce inflammation and to enhance detoxification. That said, in my opinion, that is a diet that is organic, that is high in good fats and low in carbohydrate.
Dr. Perlmutter, this has been a wonderful interview. Again, thank you for shedding light on so many of these issues, talking with us about carbohydrate and really taking a different spin than some of the other presenters, which is sugar as a toxin. So how can our listeners find you and learn more about your work?
My website is drperlmutter.com, which is drperlmutter.com. Grain Brain, which is now being published in 21 countries worldwide, is available on Amazon and in bookstores. I do Facebook a lot. I post on Facebook every day with the latest research that I think is relevant. And Facebook is David Perlmutter, MD. And I tweet several times a day, and it's at David Perlmutter. And what more can I tell you? My office phone number is 239-649-7400. And let me thank you, Deanna, for putting this together, because I'm certain this is going to be very revealing and eye-opening for so many people, and I want to thank you for it.
Well, thank you for being part of this movement. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.